The barren planet of Thoric Prime was as desolate as it was dangerous. Hidden in the furthest corner of the galaxy, it was a lawless place where criminals and bounty hunters thrived. Miles of barren wastelands stretched beneath the burnt orange sky, and the silence was often broken by the distant rumble of starships entering and leaving the planet's atmosphere. For most, Thoric Prime was a place of exile. For Layla, it had become a prison. Layla, an alien woman from the planet Cinder, was a rare sight in these parts. Her silver skin shimmered faintly under the weak light of the distant sun, and her bright violet eyes gleamed with fear. Hunted for weeks by the local crime syndicate, she had been hiding in the ruins of an old settlement on the outskirts of the city. The syndicate wanted her because of her unique telepathic abilities she had tried to keep hidden her entire life. Crouching behind a stack of broken machinery, Layla listened to the sound of footsteps approaching. The harsh, guttural voices of the men hunting her echoed in the distance. Fear surged through her body as she pressed her back against the cold metal. She was out of options. She had been on the run for days without food or water, and her strength was waning. Suddenly, a new sound reached her ears, the low hum of a ship descending from the sky. Layla's heart pounded in her chest. It was a cargo ship, old and battered, but it meant someone was here. Maybe this was her chance. As the ship landed with a loud thud, the loading ramp lowered, and a man stepped out. He was human, tall and muscular, with short brown hair and a rugged appearance. His name was Ethan, a freelance pilot hired to deliver goods to the local syndicate. He had no idea of the chaos that awaited him on Thoric Prime. Layla's breath caught in her throat as she watched Ethan unload crates from his ship. She hesitated, torn between fear and desperation. If she revealed herself, there was a chance he would turn her in for a reward. But if she didn't act now, the syndicate would catch her. With a deep breath, Layla stepped out from her hiding place, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Please, save me." Ethan froze, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, there was silence. Then, without hesitation, he dropped the crate he was carrying and reached for the blaster strapped to his hip. The air crackled with tension as Ethan quickly scanned the surroundings. His instincts, honed by years of dealing with shady characters, told him that Layla wasn't lying. There was something dangerous about this place, and he could feel it creeping closer. "Who's after you?" he asked, keeping his voice low but firm. Layla's eyes darted toward the shadows where the footsteps were getting louder. "The syndicate," she whispered. "They've been hunting me for weeks." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had heard rumors about the syndicate, ruthless, merciless, and always looking for profit. If they were after her, then he was in over his head. But there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and hope, that made him hesitate. Before he could respond, 3 men emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. They were thugs, dressed in worn-out combat gear and grinning like wolves as they spotted Layla. "Looks like we found our prize," one of them sneered. Ethan's blaster was in his hand before they could take another step. "Back off," he growled, positioning himself between the men and Layla. The leader of the group, a scared man with a missing eye, laughed. "You really think you can take all of us, pilot? We've got no business with you. Just hand over the girl, and you can walk away." Ethan's grip tightened on the blaster, his mind racing. He had no reason to get involved. He could just walk away, leave Layla to her fate, and continue with his delivery. But something inside him refused to let that happen. Maybe it was the way her voice had cracked when she asked for help. Maybe it was the desperation in her eyes. Either way, Ethan wasn't going to abandon her. "I don't think so," he said, raising his blaster. "You're going to walk away, or this ends badly for you." The thugs didn't hesitate. The leader snarled and raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Ethan pulled the trigger. A single, clean shot hit the man in the chest, dropping him to the ground. The other 2 lunged forward, but Ethan was faster. With precise aim, he took them down one by one, their bodies crumpling to the ground. Layla gasped, her eyes wide with shock. She had expected him to abandon her like everyone else had. But he had stayed. He had saved her. Ethan holstered his blaster and turned to her. "We need to move. More will be coming." Layla nodded, still in disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't thank me yet," Ethan replied, grabbing her arm gently. "We're not out of this mess." Together, they ran toward the ship, the sound of distant blaster fire growing louder as the syndicate closed in. The cargo hold of Ethan's ship was cramped and dimly lit, filled with boxes and supplies. As they hurried inside, Ethan sealed the door behind them and rushed to the cockpit. His hands flew over the controls as the engines roared to life. Layla collapsed into one of the seats, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had been moments away from capture, and now she was flying away. Safe, for now. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll be in the clear once we hit hyperspace, but it's going to be a bumpy ride." Layla nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She glanced out the small viewport as the barren landscape of Thorek Prime grew smaller and smaller beneath them. It felt surreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. The ship shuddered as it lifted off the ground, soaring through the atmosphere. Ethan guided it with practiced ease, but his mind was racing. What had he just gotten himself into? This wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to deliver goods, get paid, and leave. Now he was harboring a fugitive from one of the most dangerous crime syndicates in the galaxy. As the stars stretched into streaks of light, signaling their jump into hyperspace, Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They were safe for now, but he knew it wouldn't last. Turning to Layla, he asked, "What's your story? Why are they after you?" Layla hesitated, her eyes flicking to the floor. "It's a long story," she said quietly, "but I promise I'm not what they say I am." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her. "We'll figure it out," he said, leaning back in his chair. "First, we need to get somewhere safe." Layla looked at him, her heart still racing. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. The hum of the ship's engines filled the small cabin, a steady and comforting rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had just escaped. Layla's heart was still pounding in her chest, and her thoughts were racing just as fast. The vastness of space stretched out before them, a quiet void that somehow felt safer than the deadly planet they'd left behind. Ethan remained silent for a moment, glancing occasionally at Layla, who sat slumped in the seat, clearly exhausted. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavily in the air between them. It was only now, as the adrenaline began to wear off, that Ethan started to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. "You don't have to tell me everything right now," Ethan said, his voice low and calm. "But if I'm going to help you, I need to know what I'm up against." Layla nodded slowly, her hands gripping the armrests as if trying to anchor herself in this strange new reality. She didn't trust easily, but something about Ethan's calm demeanor made her feel that maybe, just maybe, he was someone she could rely on. Her throat felt dry, and her words came out hesitant. "I was working undercover," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I infiltrated the syndicate to gather intelligence for my people. I'm not a criminal, but they caught on to me. I barely made it out alive." Ethan listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Your people?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Layla's gaze dropped to the floor. "I'm from Shara," she said quietly, as if the name itself carried a weight of history and pain. "We've been at war with the syndicate for years. They've enslaved and exploited my people, taken over our planet piece by piece." Ethan nodded, understanding dawning on him. The Xerians were well known across the galaxy, though mostly in whispers. Their resistance against the syndicate had been ongoing for decades, but they had always been outnumbered and outgunned. That explained why Layla was so valuable to the crime syndicate. They would stop at nothing to get her back. "I see," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "So, what now? Where do we go from here?" Layla looked up at him, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "There's a Jerian outpost in the next system," she said. "It's hidden, but if we can make it there, I'll be safe. I can contact my people and—" Her sentence was cut short by a sudden jolt. The ship lurched violently to the side, throwing Layla against the wall. Ethan quickly grabbed the controls, trying to stabilize the ship, but the cockpit lights flickered ominously. "We're being followed," Ethan muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the radar. Sure enough, a blip appeared on the screen, closing in fast. The Syndicate had found them. "They're not going to let us go that easily," Layla said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "They'll chase us until they get what they want." Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had encountered Syndicate ships before, but they were usually smugglers or pirates, not full-blown bounty hunters. This was different. They were coming after Layla with everything they had. "Hang on," Ethan said, gripping the controls tightly. "This is going to get rough." The pursuing ship fired its lasers, and the blast rocked Ethan's ship again. He pulled hard on the controls, sending them into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding another hit. Layla held on as best as she could, her knuckles white from the strain. "We can't outrun them," Layla shouted over the blaring alarms. "They're too fast." Ethan's eyes darted across the control panel, searching for any option that would give them an edge. The Syndicate ship was relentless, closing the distance with every passing second. He needed to think fast. "Then we'll outsmart them," Ethan muttered under his breath. He flipped a switch on the dashboard, rerouting power from non-essential systems to the shields. The ship's engines roared in response, giving them a brief burst of speed. But it wouldn't last. The Syndicate ship was still gaining. Suddenly, an idea sparked in Ethan's mind. "Layla, I need you to trust me," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to try something risky." Layla's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Without answering, Ethan yanked the controls to the side, sending the ship into a steep nosedive. The stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light as they plummeted toward the surface of a nearby moon. Layla's stomach lurched, but she kept her eyes on Ethan, trusting that he knew what he was doing. The Syndicate ship followed, hot on their tail, its weapons still firing. As they approached the moon's surface at breakneck speed, Layla realized Ethan's plan. He wasn't trying to outrun them. He was luring them into a trap. The moon's surface was littered with deep craters and jagged mountains. One wrong move, and they'd be nothing more than debris scattered across the landscape. But Ethan's hands were steady on the controls, guiding the ship with precision as they weaved through the treacherous terrain. The Syndicate ship followed closely, but its pilot wasn't as skilled. In their haste to catch up, they clipped the edge of a crater, sending their ship spiraling out of control. "Now," Ethan shouted, pulling up hard on the controls. The ship shot upward, narrowly avoiding the surface of the moon. The Syndicate ship, however, wasn't so lucky. It slammed into the ground, exploding in a fiery blaze. Layla stared in disbelief as the explosion lit up the moon's surface. They had done it. They had escaped, for now. Ethan let out a long breath, his hand still gripping the controls. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice tense. "But that should buy us some time." Layla nodded, her heart still racing. She knew the Syndicate wouldn't stop hunting her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. As they soared back into the safety of space, Layla allowed herself to relax, just for a moment. She had escaped the clutches of the Syndicate, but the journey was far from over. The stars stretched out before them, endless and full of possibility. The quiet hum of the ship's engines was the only sound as they soared through the emptiness of space. Layla sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring out into the vast expanse, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Ethan had saved her, there was no doubt about that. But how long could they stay one step ahead of the Syndicate? Ethan broke the silence. "We're headed to the Zerian outpost, but I don't think the Syndicate is going to let us slip away that easily. They'll have more ships on us soon." Layla nodded, her eyes still fixed on the stars. She couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The Syndicate was relentless, and they had more resources than she could ever imagine. Her only hope was reaching the outpost and finding a way to regroup with her people. "They'll hunt me until they get what they want," Layla said quietly, turning to Ethan. "I don't know why you're helping me, but I can't drag you into this. The Syndicate won't stop. Ever." Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I've had my fair share of run-ins with the Syndicate. I know how dangerous they are, but I also know how to stay out of their way. Most of the time." He gave her a wry smile. "Besides, I'm not one to turn my back on someone in need." Layla studied him for a moment, her skepticism giving way to a flicker of gratitude. There was something about Ethan, his calm confidence, his willingness to help without expecting anything in return, that made her feel safer than she had in a long time. Before she could respond, the ship's proximity alarm blared, jolting them both to attention. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls as he scanned the sensors. "We've got company," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Layla's heart skipped a beat as she leaned forward to see the display. A fleet of ships had appeared on the radar, heading straight for them. "Syndicate ships. There's too many of them," Layla said, panic creeping into her voice. "We'll never make it to the outpost with them on our tail." Ethan cursed under his breath. "They must have tracked us somehow. We need to lose them before we can make the jump to hyperspace." Layla's mind raced. "There's a nebula nearby," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with determination. "It's dense enough to disrupt their sensors, but it's dangerous. We could get lost in there." Ethan glanced at her, his expression serious. "Dangerous, huh? Sounds like just what we need." He punched in the coordinates, and the ship lurched as it changed course. The Syndicate ships were closing in fast, their weapons already charging for an attack. "Hold on," Ethan shouted as the ship dove toward the nebula, the swirling clouds of gas and dust growing larger in the viewport. Lasers streaked through the void, barely missing them as the Syndicate ships opened fire. The cockpit rattled as the ship took a few glancing hits, but Ethan's hands were steady on the controls. The nebula loomed ahead, its swirling gases glowing with an eerie light. It was beautiful, in a deadly sort of way. Layla held her breath as they plunged into the thick, churning clouds, the view outside the ship disappearing into a haze of vibrant colors. The ship's sensors went haywire almost immediately, the redouts flashing erratically as the dense gas interfered with their systems. The Syndicate ships followed them in, but the nebula's interference was already working in their favor. The enemy ships were scattered, their formation breaking apart as they struggled to keep track of Ethan's ship. "They won't be able to follow us for long," Layla said, her voice tense. "But we have to be careful. One wrong move, and we could end up drifting in here forever." Ethan grunted in acknowledgement, his focus unbreakable as he navigated through the turbulent clouds. The ship rocked violently as they flew through pockets of unstable energy, but he kept them on course, weaving through the dense clouds with practiced precision. For what felt like an eternity, they flew in near-total darkness, the occasional flash of light from the nebula's energy fields the only indication that they were still moving. Layla's grip tightened on the armrests as the ship shuddered again. "We're almost through," Ethan said, his voice strained as he fought the controls. Suddenly, a bright flash of light filled the cockpit, followed by a deafening boom. The ship lurched violently, sending Layla tumbling out of her seat. Alarms blared, and the smell of burning circuits filled the air. "We've been hit," Ethan shouted, pulling up on the controls to stabilize the ship. Layla scrambled back into her seat, her heart racing. "How did they?" Before she could finish her question, another blast rocked the ship. The Syndicate had managed to track them even through the nebula. They weren't out of danger yet. "We can't take another hit like that," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. "Our shields are barely holding." Layla's mind raced, searching for a solution. "There's a Jerian signal beacon on the other side of the nebula," she said. "If we can reach it, my people will come for us." Ethan's eyes flicked to her, then back to the controls. "I hope you're right. Hang on." With a final burst of speed, the ship shot out of the nebula, the swirling clouds giving way to the vast, empty expanse of space once more. The Syndicate ships were still behind them, but the nebula had slowed them down enough to give Ethan and Layla a fighting chance. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls as he activated the ship's emergency beacon, sending a distress signal out into the void. "Now we wait," he said, his voice grim. "Let's hope your people get here before the Syndicate does." Layla nodded, her chest tightening with anxiety. The Zarian outpost was close, but so were the Syndicate ships. Time was running out, and she could only pray that help would come before it was too late. The distress signal pulsed into the emptiness of space, a beacon of hope amidst the swirling tension in the cockpit. Layla and Ethan exchanged glances, the weight of their predicament hanging heavy between them. Their ship limped forward, battered and barely holding together, as the distant flashes of the Syndicate's fleet cut through the darkness behind them. "How long before your people arrive?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with urgency. Layla glanced at the console, checking the readout for any signs of incoming allies. "I don't know. Jerian patrols are fast, but the outpost is still several light years away." Ethan grimaced, his hands gripping the controls. "We don't have that long." The ship's alarms blared once more, and a shudder ran through the hull as another laser blast grazed their shields. The Syndicate ships had closed the distance again, their persistence as relentless as their firepower. "They're not letting up," Layla muttered, panic threatening to creep into her voice. "We're sitting ducks out here." Ethan's mind raced, calculating their dwindling options. He wasn't one to give up easily, but the odds were stacked impossibly high. Still, there was one last move they could make, a gamble that could either save them or end in disaster. "We have one shot," Ethan said, his tone firm. "I can overload the ship's core and release an energy pulse. It'll knock out the Syndicate sensors long enough for us to escape, but it'll leave us dead in the water too. No shields, no engines, nothing. We'll be completely defenseless until your people arrive." Layla's eyes widened. "That's insane. What if they still manage to find us? We'll be helpless." Ethan met her gaze, his expression resolute. "It's either that or wait here and let them blast us to pieces. This way, we at least have a chance." Layla swallowed hard, weighing the risk. Ethan's plan was dangerous, but it was the only option that might give them a fighting chance. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Do it," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. Ethan didn't waste time. He quickly moved to the engineering console, rerouting power from the ship's systems, and priming the core for overload. The ship's lights flickered, and the hum of the engines grew louder as the core built up energy. "Get ready," Ethan warned, his hands flying over the controls. "This is going to be rough." The Syndicate ships were closing in, their weapons charging for another barrage. Layla braced herself, her heart pounding in her chest. "Now," Ethan shouted. The ship lurched violently as the core released a blinding pulse of energy. The cockpit was bathed in brilliant white light as the pulse surged outward, enveloping the Syndicate ships. Their sensors and weapon systems flickered and died, leaving them momentarily blind in the void. But the pulse had come at a cost. The ship's systems went dark, and the hum of the engines fell silent. The lights flickered once more before plunging the cockpit into dim emergency lighting. They were adrift, defenseless. Layla held her breath, her knuckles white, as she gripped the armrests of her seat. The Syndicate ships floated silently in the distance, disoriented and unable to track them. For now, they were hidden, but it wouldn't last long. Ethan slumped back in his chair, letting out a heavy breath. "We bought ourselves some time," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Now we wait." The moments stretched into an agonizing silence, broken only by the faint crackling of the ship's failing systems. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the threat of discovery looming over them like a storm cloud. Layla glanced at the sensor display, hoping, praying, for any sign of incoming help. And then, as if in answer to her silent plea, the screen flickered. A small blip appeared on the edge of the radar, rapidly approaching. Layla's heart leaped into her throat. "Is that?" she began. Ethan checked the display, his eyes narrowing. Could be them, or it could be more Syndicate ships. Layla leaned closer, her breath catching as the blip grew closer. As the ship came into visual range, her eyes widened in relief. It was a Xerian patrol cruiser. Her people. "They found us," she whispered, a wave of emotion washing over her. "We're going to make it." The Xerian cruiser wasted no time. As it closed the distance, it sent out a communication signal, and a voice crackled through the ship's speakers. "This is Commander Terran of the Xerian Defense Fleet. We've received your distress call. Prepare for docking. Help is on the way." Layla slumped back in her seat, the tension that had gripped her body finally releasing. They were safe, at least for now. Ethan leaned back, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like your people came through." Layla looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Ethan shrugged, his expression softening. "Guess we make a good team after all." As the Xerian cruiser approached for docking, Layla allowed herself to hope, for the first time in a long time, that maybe, just maybe, they had a real shot at escaping the Syndicate's grasp. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. And the deeper they got into this, the more she realized she couldn't run from her past forever. Soon, she'd have to face it head-on. But for now, she was ready to fight. And she wasn't alone. The Xerian cruiser docked with Ethan's ship, and within moments, a team of soldiers flooded aboard. They moved with military precision, securing the ship and assessing the situation. Layla stood, still shaken, as Commander Terran strode into the cockpit, a tall figure in crisp Xerian uniform. "Layla Vos," Terran greeted, his voice stern but respectful. "We received your signal just in time. But you need to understand, the Syndicate won't stop hunting you." Layla nodded, her mind whirling. "I know, but I can't keep running forever." Terran's sharp eyes flicked to Ethan. "And this is your accomplice." Ethan raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Just a guy with a ship who got caught up in all this." Layla stepped forward, her tone determined. "Ethan saved my life, Commander. He's not part of the Syndicate. He's with me." Terran regarded them both, then nodded slowly. "Very well. You'll both come with us. We'll debrief on the cruiser and decide our next steps. But make no mistake, this isn't over. The Syndicate will send more ships, and they won't rest until you're dead." As they boarded the Xerian cruiser, Layla felt a knot tightening in her stomach. The weight of her past was catching up to her. And she knew there was only one way to end this. She had to confront the Syndicate herself. On board the cruiser, Layla and Ethan were given a small room to rest, though neither could sleep. Layla paced the floor, her mind racing with thoughts of the Syndicate and how to bring them down. Ethan sat at the edge of the bunk, watching her with concern. "You can't keep running forever," Ethan said gently, echoing her earlier thoughts. "What's your plan? We can't stay with the Xerians indefinitely." Layla paused, staring out the viewport at the distant stars. "I know," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But there's something I haven't told you. The Syndicate doesn't just want to kill me. They want to control me." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Layla turned to face him, her eyes haunted. "I used to work for them, a long time ago. I was part of their intelligence division, one of their best operatives. I know things, secrets that could destroy them from the inside." Ethan's eyes widened in realization. "That's why they're after you. You're a threat." Layla nodded. "I've been on the run ever since I defected. But I can't run anymore. I have to face them. Expose their secrets. Bring them down. It's the only way. Ethan stood, crossing the room to stand beside her. And how do you plan to do that? The Syndicate has resources, armies. They won't just roll over. Layla clenched her fists, determination flaring in her eyes. There's a data vault on Veritos Prime, one of their main operations hubs. It contains everything. Their deals, their operatives, their whole network. If we can get to it, I can upload the data to the Galactic Council. It'll expose them and put the entire Syndicate in jeopardy. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a suicide mission. Layla met his gaze, her voice firm. Maybe, but it's our only chance. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right. If you're going to do this, I'm with you. But we're going to need more than just a plan. We're going to need allies. The next day, Layla and Ethan met with Commander Terran in the war room. A holographic map of the Syndicate's known territories flickered before them, showing the sprawling criminal empire that Layla had once been a part of. We've analyzed the data from your distress signal, Terran began. The Syndicate is mobilizing. They know you're with us, and they'll stop at nothing to get you back. But you're right. Their data vault on Veritos Prime could be the key to crippling their operations. Layla leaned over the map, her mind focused. We need a strike team, small enough to infiltrate without detection, but strong enough to handle whatever security they throw at us. Terran nodded. I can spare a team of elite soldiers, but this will be dangerous. Once we make our move, the Syndicate will retaliate. We'll need to hit hard and fast. Ethan crossed his arms, looking at the map thoughtfully. We'll need more than just muscle. We need someone who knows the Syndicate's inner workings, someone who can get us in without setting off alarms. Layla hesitated, then spoke up. There's someone. Her name's Mara Jax. She used to be my partner, back when I worked for the Syndicate. She's still in the game, running her own smuggling ring. If anyone can get us in, it's her. Terran frowned. Can she be trusted? Layla gave a grim smile. Trust isn't the word I'd use, but she hates the Syndicate as much as I do. If I can convince her that we're serious about taking them down, she'll help us. Terran nodded. Very well. We'll move on your signal. But remember, once this starts, there's no turning back. Mara Jax was everything Layla remembered. Sharp, dangerous, and unpredictable. After a tense negotiation in a remote sector of space, Mara agreed to help. Her condition: a cut of whatever bounty the Galactic Council would place on the Syndicate's leaders once they were exposed. Together, the team set course for Veritos Prime. The plan was simple but perilous. Mara would use her smuggler connections to get them inside the Syndicate's vault facility, disguised as part of a routine shipment. Once inside, Layla would hack into the vault's mainframe, download the data, and transmit it to the Galactic Council before the Syndicate knew what hit them. But as they touched down on Veritos Prime, Layla's heart pounded in her chest. The planet was a hotbed of criminal activity, and everywhere she looked, there were reminders of her past. She had to stay focused. One wrong move, and the Syndicate would capture her for good. Mara led the way through the bustling streets, their cargo crates in tow. Stay close, Mara whispered. This place is crawling with Syndicate thugs. As they approached the vault facility, Layla's pulse quickened. The facility loomed before them, heavily guarded and imposing. Mara flashed her credentials, and after a tense moment, the guards waved them through. Inside, everything moved quickly. Layla, Ethan, and Mara made their way to the vault's secure data terminal. Layla's fingers flew over the controls, bypassing layers of encryption as alarms silently blinked on her screen. They're onto us, Layla muttered. I need more time. Ethan drew his blaster, his eyes scanning the corridor. We don't have much. The door bursts open, and Syndicate enforcers poured in, guns blazing. Ethan and Mara opened fire, holding them off as Layla completed the download. Her heart raced. Seconds felt like hours. Got it, she shouted. yanking the data chip from the terminal. But as they turned to escape, cold, familiar voice stopped Layla in her tracks. Well, look who decided to come home. Layla froze. Standing in the doorway was Darius Core, the syndicate leader she had betrayed all those years ago. His cold eyes fixed on her, and a twisted smile spread across his face. "I've been waiting for this," he said. Darius stepped forward, his gaze locked on Layla. "You thought you could escape me forever, didn't you? You should have stayed hidden." Layla's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "I'm not running anymore, Darius. It ends here." Darius chuckled darkly, his hand resting on the blaster at his hip. "You really think you can stop the syndicate? You, a traitor and a coward?" Layla's eyes narrowed. "I'm not alone this time." In that instant, a barrage of laser fire erupted as the Jerian strike team burst into the room, catching the syndicate enforcers off guard. The room descended into chaos as Layla, Ethan, and Mara fought their way through the melee, the data chip clutched tightly in Layla's hand. Darius aimed his blaster at her, but Ethan tackled him before he could fire, the two of them grappling for control of the weapon. Layla rushed toward the exit, but Darius's voice echoed through the din. "You can't escape, Layla," he roared. "I'll hunt you to the ends of the galaxy." Layla hesitated for a brief moment, then turned back to face him. "No, you won't." With a swift motion, she threw a small detonator onto the data terminal behind him. The explosion rocked the room, and Darius was thrown to the ground, his eyes wide with shock as the vault facility collapsed around him. Layla sprinted toward the exit, where Ethan and Mara were waiting. The syndicate forces were in disarray, their leaders cut off and their network exposed. As they boarded their ship and launched into space, Layla stared out at the burning wreckage of the facility below. It was over. The syndicate's reign of terror was finished. The data they had recovered was transmitted to the Galactic Council, and within days, arrest warrants were issued for the remaining syndicate leaders. The galaxy was free from their grip, and Layla could finally breathe. She stood on the deck of Ethan's ship, watching the stars twinkle in the vast expanse of space. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced her past, and she had won. Ethan joined her, leaning against the railing with a smile. "So what now?" Layla looked at him, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Now we see what's out there, together." As they flew into the stars, Layla knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wasn't facing them alone. And for the first time in her life, that was enough.